it. Okay, if at any time you can't hear me, just let me know. I think with all this load shedding that's going around, things are, again, a little bit unpredictable for all of us, but hopefully I'm good for the moment. So hopefully it stays. The assignment is due. Yep, I know the assignment is due. I hope you guys all got the link to the national support session tomorrow night. We'll just go through that. I did delay this learning unit just for you guys to catch up with yourselves. So I hope that you are sort of feeling on top of things, and well done for getting all your ICE tasks in. I think everybody did a good job. So hopefully that will do something for us. So this learning unit is on conditioning and learning, and gratefully we had that nice ICE task that was on Pavlov. So there's a little bit of my work done for me, and hopefully done for you too, that it's maybe uncomplicated, some things that if you start from scratch are complicated. But let's just hit the road with this. It seems like it's a little bit long, but I'll try and move quite quickly and just focus in on the core stuff that you need to know. All right, so this is our last learning unit. Can you believe it? It seems like time's just come and gone. So learning unit 6 is on conditioning and learning. This is taken from your student guide, your module guide, basically an overview of what you'll need to know. So again, different outcomes, definition of learning, we'll touch on that. We'll touch on classical conditioning, that's where Pavlov comes in. And a lot of these names you should have heard already in some of the work we've done. So Pavlov is classical conditioning, operant conditioning is Skinner. I think we've all had a brief look at Skinner and Skinner boxes, so that's where operant conditioning comes in. And the last piece of it is observational learning, which is Bandura. So we're just going to look quickly at what a definition of learning is, and then just touch on these 3 different types of learning, processes that can take place. So when we look at learning, we just also have to be clear in our heads about what learning is. And I know this isn't part of your book, but there are things called reflexes. We all know what reflexes are. Is they basically, if you tap your knee and your knee jumps, it's a reflex. It's controlled by your nervous system. You've got instincts, which are sort of your inborn patterns of behavior. We sometimes feel that our gut is telling us certain things, and those are what our instincts are. But learning itself, where we actually physically learning is a relatively permanent change of behavior, and it's based on experience. So that's a key definition of learning, is that it is pretty much a permanent change. And learning is advantageous to us all for survival. That's how we live. We live through learning. We live through changing our behaviors. And the change that happens within us is due to learning. Okay, it's learning from experience. It's not a developmental change. Learning something is very different from just a normal developmental process. It's actually, we've learned something from an experience, and it's a relatively permanent change. It's not brief or unstable. It's a process we go through, and it's pretty fixed in our behavior, in the outcomes in terms of our behavior patterns. So that's just understanding what learning is, and just that it does differ from things like reflexes and things. So learning, we all are aware of what learning is. We're learning now. We're learning all the time. It's knowing something we didn't know before. So we didn't know it, now we do. Or it's getting a skill that we couldn't do something, and now we can do it. We're able to do something. And it's a fundamental concept at the core of psychology. And you can see that by those theorists who we're going to look at, that they've been around for a long time, and it's been a key piece of psychology around learning. Learning can, as you know, shape our habits, what we do. It can shape our beliefs. It can shape our personality. It can shape our emotional responses to things. It can shape our preferences. So that's where you can see within psychology that learning has a very big impact on our behavior, our mental habits, our cognitive thinking. It's very instrumental in those changes. And it's a process. So learning is actually the process that is involved behind what we see. So when we see a behavior, that's what we observe. We don't observe the learning. The learning is what takes place behind that behavior. And we assume that something has been learned when changes in behavior take place. So we assume then that there's been some kind of learning. So that's a sort of overview of a definition, and you can pick up some key things from that. So if we have to look at what the definition of learning is, it's a process. The outcome of the process is observable changes in behavior. It's relatively permanent. It's a fundamental concept at the core of psychology. So that touches on the definition of learning. So in this module, what we do, just generally, there are three main types of learning that we're going to look at now. There's what is called classical conditioning. That's where we spoke about Pavlov, and we'll go into Pavlov. But basically, classical conditioning, and you can see it with the dog, and the example is that it's basically involuntary. And it's about associating pairs of stimuli together so that a learning takes place. So, for example, with a bee sting, you learned through being stung by a bee that it's a source of pain, therefore you develop a fear of a bee. It's an association between a bee and a sting and pain. It's about linking those things together. So we're forming associations or connections amongst stimuli. Okay, so the second type of learning is called operant conditioning. And operant conditioning is voluntary behavior. It's not involuntary, it's voluntary. Something like the example that's classic, and if you remember the examples, it does help you remember the definition. If you study hard, you get good grades. So you can see classical conditioning is about linking those two stimuli together, forming an association, whereas operant conditioning is about a voluntary behavior, about forming associations between behaviors and their consequences. So it reinforces that behavior. The harder you study, the better your grades are. Therefore, you study hard to get good grades. And the final kind of learning we'll touch on tonight is called observational learning. And that's learning through watching. Okay, it's like social learning and modeling. So we learn by watching what happens to other people or the actions of other people. So three types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So conditioning in essence means it's a process of learning associations between things, between events and the environment. And the actual association is the link that's made between those things. So we're learning by association. So those are the three types of learning that we'll touch on in this particular module. So we remember Pavlov. We've done Pavlov and we understand what it is. The important thing was this is just to be familiar with some of the terms, which I'll highlight as we go, and just really understand. Sorry, I just want to make sure my phone doesn't beep, so I'm just going to turn it off. And to really understand some of the terms. So classical conditioning, our first kind of learning, is about forming associations or links between two things, two pairs of stimuli that follow sequentially. So something happens, then something else happens. That's what sequentially means. There's a time delay between the two things happening. So a certain response has been created by a stimulus. So the stimulus can be anything, okay? It can be an object, it can be a behavior or an event. It's something that triggers the response. So classical conditioning does explain many of our learned responses to things that happen in the environment, like the bee sting. Classical conditioning will explain that fear of a bee. Classical conditioning can be used to explain anxiety. Classical conditioning can be used to explain phobias. It's about our response to a specific stimuli. So the first thing that happens, and this is just a very simple picture of Pavlov's conditioning process, and I'm aware about, the fact that he didn't end up using the bell, but the bell is just a simple way of explaining it. So before anything happens, the chicken, top left-hand corner, a chicken or food gets presented to a dog. It's an unconditioned stimulus. The dog has not been conditioned to react to that. It's completely unconditioned. It's almost reflexive that the dog salivates. Okay, so the chicken, there's no conditioning. It hasn't been conditioned into the dog, and the dog has an unconditioned response. It just salivates automatically. So you have an unconditioned stimulus, nothing has happened to it, okay? And you then have the unconditioned response. So no prior experience, it just happens. Then what happens is a neutral stimulus. So again, there's no association to the stimulus at all. It's completely neutral. It doesn't create the salivation. If you ring the bell, it's a completely neutral thing. Nothing happens to the dog. It's a very neutral stimulus. There's no salivation, no conditioned response. It's just a bell ringing with the dog sitting there. During the actual process of conditioning, the chicken or the food and the bell are presented simultaneously. So you have those two completely unrelated things. The bell that is neutral is now being paired with that chicken that is unconditioned, that causes the salivation. So what the process of conditioning does, it makes the dog link the bell to the chicken. So now the bell is a conditioned stimulus. The dog has been taught to associate, that's the link, the bell with food. So the bell itself can induce the conditioned response of salivation. So the dog is not naturally salivating at that bell. It's not a reflex now in the dog. It's actually a conditioned response. It's been learnt. It's a learned response that's happened through classical conditioning. I hope that makes sense, but that just in a very basic way is understanding what classical conditioning is. It's something unconditioned, a stimulus and a response that's almost reflexive, being paired with something so that it creates a conditioned response. And that is simply how Pavlov's experiment works with conditioning. So this is from, I think, the book. So it's just a very simple diagrammatic format. So before conditioning, before any kind of learning has taken place, that neutral stimulus, the bell or the tone, elicits no response. Okay, whereas in Pavlov's case, he used a meat powder. The meat powder was also unconditioned, created an unconditioned response of salivation. No learning at all. During the conditioning process, the neutral stimulus that had no response attached to it is now paired with that unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder, to still create, because the meat powder is still creating that unconditioned response. And after conditioning process, then that conditioned stimulus becomes the bell, which creates the conditioned response. So that's the summary. An originally neutral stimulus, the bell, comes to elicit a response that it didn't previously elicit. It's a very simple process, and that is what classical conditioning is, and how Pavlov used it to understand it. So like I said to you, classical conditioning in our everyday life, I mean, if you see that picture of the spider, it could automatically in you make the hair on the back of your arm stand up. You don't know why necessarily. It can be that you have a fear of spiders. A lot of us don't know why we have certain phobias or fears about things. They just appear to be there. We've been conditioned through various processes to fear something. So that is what the conditioning process does. So when we look at fears and anxieties and phobias and conditioned fears, if we look at what a phobia is, and often we don't know, it's an irrational fear. We often don't know why we've got a phobia of something. Somebody might be scared of heights the first time they go up a mountain or stand on a cliff face or go onto the top of a tall building, and you're scared. You might never have been up there before. It's almost like an irrational fear. You can't narrow it down as to why. But it can be narrowed down often to an experience that's involved classical conditioning. The example I think they give in the book is about the lady who's swimming in the lake, and I think her father drowned, and so then she was then conditioned to fear swimming in water. There was an actual experience there that involved classical conditioning that created that fear in her. And often when you pair that neutral stimulus with a negative unconditioned stimulus, you can get a negative attitude towards the stimulus, and that's really what a fear or a conditioned fear is. So it can explain how we acquire phobias. For example, we learn to associate something we do not fear, a dog, as a neutral stimulus, with something that triggers a fear response, such as being bitten. So you might have loved dogs. Dogs might have made you happy, but a dog bit you. Okay, so the dog that was previously neutral has now been paired with biting. An association has been formed, a conditioned stimulus, that's what it's become, and now you've got a conditioned fear response. And often from that, we can develop a phobia. So classical conditioning is the process by which we can learn or be conditioned to fear things from our situations around us. We can somehow also react with fear instinctively. Sometimes we are instinctively scared of something, and that's to do with our brain makeup. And the amygdala in our brain can be activated by fear stimuli, meaning someone might not consciously be aware of the fear. And people with a conditioned response can have an enhanced response, so it can actually make it worse. So the hippocampus in our brain can take those fear impulses and link it with previously existing information that we might have been scared with, and it can exacerbate the fear. So as much as we learn to fear something, our fear can get worse through processes within our brain, and the fear can actually turn into a phobia. Sometimes we're not sure why. It can be irrational. I hope that makes sense to everybody. And so anxiety. Okay, so the phobia is the extreme, the fear is the extreme, but we also have everyday anxiety responses to things. Again, sometimes we're not sure why. And anxiety is less severe than a phobia. And I think in psychology, when people present with anxious symptoms, it's to try and understand where that anxiety has come from and if it's been learned from something in our environment. So the sound of a dentist's drill could cause anxiety. In some cases, it can cause fear. It doesn't me. So you might have had experienced pain while the dentist has been working in your mouth. So the pain is paired with the sound of the drill. Therefore, the drill becomes the conditioned stimulus, and our conditioned response to that drill is anxiety. And again, whether that fear conditioning takes place depends on previous history, what has happened in the past with the drill. I had a bad experience in a dentist's rooms when he was doing a root canal, and so now I have more than anxiety for a dentist. I have fear. Thank you, Pernell. And maybe you know why you've got a fear of spiders. We'll touch on it just now, that there are things around genetic and the evolutionary component of fear that causes us to sort of become fearful of things, but we're not sure why. So that's like the negative side of it, but also remember that this classical conditioning can have a positive side to it. We can have pleasant emotional responses to things. So it's not always negative. It depends on you, but sometimes in about August, when the Christmas music starts playing in the supermarket or on the music channels, and some of you then might go, oh, it's Christmas, it's a family time, and you associate good things with that. So that's also classical conditioning. You've been classically conditioned into a positive response. A mom who I know with my daughter, there are smells that trigger me from when she was small, like baby shampoo. Everyone goes, oh, smell the baby shampoo, and it makes you feel all maternal about your child. It's also a conditioned response. So we now associate that baby shampoo with the feeling of maternal love for a child. We can also have a physiological response. That means our body reacts. Think about, I put those candles there because the thought I had was if those of us who sometimes are lucky enough to go into a spa, to have a treatment, and that when you go into a spa, there's a smell. They might have an aromatherapy oil, and you're now associating or linking that stimuli of that sort of smell with a pleasant feeling of relaxation. So it's almost now when I go and buy a nice soap or I go and buy a candle, I look for a smell, and that makes me think about this, makes me feel like I'm in a spa with these beautiful smells. Because my body now, the minute I light the candle, sort of automatically says, oh, you're in a happy place, and it relaxes me without even being there. It's a physiological response to a stimuli. And again, an important role of this conditioning sits in advertising. And our attitudes, that if people around us or people are doing advertisements pair things with positive stimuli or decrease with negative stimuli, it can change attitudes. So if every time a Coca-Cola advert comes on, there's some happy music playing or a jingle, when you hear that jingle at a later stage, you might think of Coca-Cola and happiness. So you're creating those, you're being conditioned by the people in advertising to want that product because they have conditioned you to associate happiness with Coca-Cola or happy music with Coca-Cola or whatever it is. So yeah, again, it's a controversial subject as to how advertising can create these experiences, but remember that conditioning is all about learning. Also associated with negative stimuli, junk food, for example, or smoking, a picture of a bad lung with smoking, we can be conditioned to associate smoking with negative health implications, therefore we stop smoking, or I hope we do. So classical conditioning has a number of roles in our lives and ongoing, and often below, it's sort of almost subconscious that a lot of the classical conditioning takes place. So just some of the terms and things, that the processes involved with classical conditioning. So there's the little dog, and he says, here comes my food, because the bell's ringing. But it can get to a point when the process can actually be made extinct. To hell with your bell. Or if there hasn't been that association for a while, and then someone rings a bell a bit later, there can almost be a spontaneous recovery to that pairing if it hasn't happened for a while. So the word acquisition that we look at is basically the development, the acquiring of that conditioned response. That's what acquisition means. We are acquiring the conditioned response to that stimulus. The stimulus contiguity means that there has to be time, an approximate time between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Things have got to be in close proximity to each other in time. Another thing that we can look at is sometimes stimuli that are new or unusual or intense. We can sometimes be more conditioned to them. When something happens for the first time and we smell a smell for the first time and it makes a big difference, we haven't smelt it before, and we sense it a lot more, could have a bigger effect in becoming a conditioned stimuli. We've also got a chemical in our brain, dopamine, that gives a pleasurable feeling when released. So a burst of chemicals in our brain, that pleasurable feeling when a reward is received, can increase that conditioned response. But if there's not enough reward, the response can become extinct. So there is a number of things in the acquisition process of these associations that come from our environment around us, our past experience, the intensity of what we're experiencing. So conditioned responses, like the dog and his food, can undergo extinction if that link is broken. Okay, so we try and ring the bell, and it's working, and if then we don't do that trial for a long time, or a couple of days or a couple of weeks, it's almost like it would become extinct. It's forgotten about in a way. The bell would ring, but no food would appear. The outcome is the dogs would stop salivating at the sound of the bell. So think about that in a psychological process. If you've got a behavior or a bad behavior in somebody that is being brought out as a conditioned response to something, the first thing you could do is sort of unlink them, would be a sort of an unscientific word, in the hope that the behavior becomes extinct. It can be a form of treatment. But what it really does is, rather than take that memory away altogether, it just suppresses it. So there is the impact that is the renewal effect, is that the response is extinguished in a different environment, but return to the original environment can bring back the response. Think about someone who's an alcoholic, who used to drink in a certain bar, and there was something in the, whatever it might have been, and he became a recovering alcoholic, and he was absolutely fine until he went back to that bar. So returns to the original environment they were in can bring back the response. And so spontaneous recovery, that association can come back. So the conditioned response reappears after extinction training. So new learning overrides old learning. It's different to forgetting. You haven't forgotten that response, you have just suppressed it. So the concepts of extinction and spontaneous recovery are applying classical conditioning, and also we'll see it in operant conditioning as well. So those are some terms that you sort of need to be aware of to understand the process of classical conditioning. So again, within that is that generalization. So the stimulus might not always be exactly the same, but we could also respond to stimuli that are similar. So it can be a generalization. So like the lady in the lake where the father drowned, she might have been conditioned to a lake, but suddenly her fear became all water. To the point where it can become involved in a panic disorder. If you have an incident in a shopping mall, like one in Durban or wherever you are, suddenly that gets generalized to all shopping malls. So those stimuli can be completely generalized to a much bigger scale, which can then, you can see, it can lead to that panic disorder. So the experiment that is quite, it's obviously a very controversial experiment. It's called the conditioning of little Albert. And little Albert was a baby, and basically he was conditioned to fear a rat. So every time this little white rat was presented to the baby, they would bang a gong. So a bit like Pavlov and the food, now we've got a rat and a gong. So although the child initially, you presented the rat to little Albert wasn't scared of the rat. But once the rat was paired with that loud gong, little Albert came to fear the rat. He was conditioned to fear that rat. But what happened with little Albert, and it happens in subsequent experiments, is then he actually, that conditioning of fearing that white rat, then he feared everything white. So if a white rabbit was brought along, or a white Father Christmas beard, an old man with a white beard, suddenly now that response to the white rat had now been generalized to everything white. So you can see how that's a very controversial experiment, but that is conditioning to the process of generalization of that stimuli beyond the rat. And also discrimination. So discrimination means that we can fine-tune differences between stimuli. So it's a little bit like the generalization, but it's working the other way. We can discriminate between small differences, tones, for example, and adapt our behavior accordingly. So those are two more words that are used in the process of learning, is generalizing stimuli to all stimuli that are similar, and also discriminating between. And obviously, as you work cognitively, I'm trying to think which is the best example, it's higher order conditioning. So that's simple conditioning, but also it can start to work on higher levels in our thinking. And it allows us to actually make distance predictions about events that might happen. So it's where you take the original stimulus out of the equation, and then the conditioned stimulus now starts to be paired with another new unconditioned stimulus, and it's almost like a whole chain reaction that can take place. And that's often what our conditioned responses are based upon. So higher order conditioning, it's almost like a second order conditioning. So the cat on the right is salivating to the unconditioned response of the food, it's conditioned to the sound of the can opener. So now it associates the sound of opening the can with supper. But the can opener comes out of a cupboard. Okay, so the cupboard door squeaks. So now the cupboard door is the unconditioned stimulus, and the can opener is the conditioned stimulus. The cat salivates. Now the cat salivates to the squeaky door. So it's almost like the food is gone, the can opener has gone, and now the next layer of stimuli that's coming in is the squeaky door. And that's like a process of conditioning where we're starting to respond to things that weren't even in the initial conditioning process. It's higher order conditioning. The example on the right is you might go to a dance and dance with a partner. A certain song comes on, you dance with your partner, have a very pleasant feeling. Therefore, that song had a sort of, the song was the neutral stimulus, the dancing was the unconditioned stimulus, the pleasant feelings was the unconditioned response. Therefore, the certain song is now conditioning you to pleasant feelings. Second order conditioning is you get in the car, which is not linked to anything, it's completely neutral, but the song comes on the radio. So then those pleasant feelings, oh, I remember dancing to that song with my partner, I got happy feelings. Now, what happens is you get in the car without even putting the radio on, can almost cause pleasant feelings. So it's like moving it up a chain of thinking processes. I hope that makes sense to you. But that's how classical conditioning can work in our sort of unconscious to help us learn from the initial response that we had. Operant conditioning, second part. So remember, operant conditioning, we're talking about behavior and consequences of behavior. So this is where we start to talk about rewards and punishment and outcomes or consequences of behavior. So operant conditioning was quite involuntary, and you can see from our explanations, those kind of things are involuntary responses. Whereas operant conditioning is it's learning which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened depending on its favorable outcomes. It's a voluntary response. We are making that choice. It's not a reaction to something, but it's a direct result of us operating on our environment to produce an outcome. Okay, and the outcome that happens, and we're very much influenced by the outcome that follows the behavior. So the response might be strengthened or weakened, depending on whether the outcome is favorable or less favorable. But what we mean by that is that the behavior would occur more often or less often. Okay, it doesn't remove the behavior. It's about just saying the behavior would be strengthened or weakened. So the study hard, we get good grades. The reinforcement of that is when an event following a response increases the likelihood of the subject making that response in the future. So if I study hard, I get good grades, the chances are on the next test, I'm going to study as hard or harder. Okay, I would continue to make that response. So the example that they give for Thorndike really was one of the guys who sort of worked, or theorists who worked alongside Skinner, had cats in a box. So Skinner had rats in a box and Thorndike had a cat in a box, and it was called the law of effect. So basically he put the cat in a puzzle box that he'd made himself, and the aim was for the cat to escape from the box, and the only way the cat could escape from the box was by pulling a cord. So once the cat did everything, it might have banged a bell or pawed the wall or done whatever it needed to do to get to the food outside the box. But once it figured out it could pull that string and the trapdoor opened, or the cord, that's the behavior it continued to perform. It stopped producing the behaviors that weren't actually taking it to the reward. So it's the law of effect. If I do this, then something pleasurable happens. I can get my food. So Thorndike started to experiment with operant conditioning around teaching cats to get out of the puzzle box, by teaching them to carry on with the learned behavior and to stop the behaviors that were not actually helping the cat get to the food on the other side of the trapdoor. So again, we operant conditioning, same thing, it's Skinner. And I think a lot of you did Skinner in your assignment, where you did a bit of research around Skinner. So helping me help you is that it's not a new situation. But Skinner put rats in a box, also had pigeons in a box, but specifically rats in a box. And the rat learned to push a lever. And when it pushed the lever, it got food given to it. And once it had learned the response, it did it more and more frequently. Okay, push the lever for food. So a primary reinforcer is basically, it's reinforced because it fulfills a biological need, that food in an animal's life, in our lives, if we do something that triggers anything that fulfills a primary need, we would do it. It's a primary reinforcer. It's almost like it's innate in us to push a lever and get food because especially when we're hungry. And a secondary reinforcer is something it's learned and conditioned to acquire reinforcing qualities by being associated with primary reinforcers. So food might not necessarily be the primary reinforcer, but it could be something to do with a smell. That we have now learned that smell that's linked to the primary reinforcer means that we will be rewarded with food. So that's Skinner, and Skinner's in your book, and I won't go into it in too much detail because I don't want to run out of time, but just again understand how the Skinner box worked. As you can see, that the rat also was not only subjected to pushing the lever and to get food, but the rat was also subjected to a negative shock current running through the bottom of that box, which would give it shocks. So we'll touch on that when we speak about some of the processes involved in operant conditioning. Again, the same words, acquisition. Acquisition means beginning stages of learning something new. That's what it is. We're acquiring a behavior because of the favorable outcome that it is achieving. Shaping. So think about training a dog. Or even, let's do a dog. It's a gradual process. It's often not immediate. Okay, so you start with something small, or you reinforce. So if you want the dog to sit just on its hind legs and beg, you would start initially by shaping with just the dog shaking a paw. So, and you'd reward that, and then gradually you could shape the behavior until you get closer to the behavior that you're looking for. And you could also narrow down the requirements. So maybe initially it gets a big treat, then it might get a small treat. Or when it goes back up onto its back legs again, or its hind legs, it gets a bigger treat. So you can shape people's behavior by rewarding them, rewarding the approximation of the behavior you're looking for until it gets to a point when they actually perform the behavior. Again, when you raise children, shaping and how we raise our children, what we reward or punish them for, is about shaping their behavior, and it's part of the process of operant conditioning. So again, we come to the same terms, extinction, same as classical conditioning, and again links very much to behavior, is that the response could disappear if it's not being followed by the reinforcers. So if you say to a child, say please, and they get rewarded with a sweet, eventually you might get to the point where you're stopping that response and you're not giving them a sweet, and then they stop saying please altogether. So again, you can make behaviors become extinct. You'll find with the rat, it gets to a point where some behaviors are very hard to extinguish. And again, that's where we speak to addictions and things like that, that you can't just stop a behavior. Some behaviors are easier to remove than others. So the rat, for example, could push the button and no food would come, but the rat would push the lever less frequently. It would still carry on pushing the lever, but maybe do it less frequently. So the behavior doesn't just disappear. There's a process that needs to be followed to try and get a behavior to stop happening. Let's see the picture. That shaping is an example of shaping is with our pigeon. I hope no one's scared of pigeons. I give the pigeon food when it turns towards the button. So it turns is the first behavior. You're going to start the process of shaping. You give the pigeon food when it walks towards the button. So now we're starting to shape the behavior a bit more. You give the pigeon food when it taps the button with its beak. Okay, and that's the final step. Sorry, step 3 is give the pigeon food when it raises its head and then when it touches the button. So you shaped it into linking it to that button. And again, generalization and discrimination, stimuli that come before a response can influence the behavior. So, you know, if certain things are in that environment and happen before you give the child the sucker, maybe it performed a good behavior, and then the sucker comes and you say, please, is that you can link it, or you can generalize it to a bigger context. Sorry, that sounded messy, and I don't know why. Sorry about that. I'll try and think of a better way to say it for you. So reinforcement, that's what we do. We reinforce behavior. At a high level, reinforcement is a process by which you encourage a particular behavior so it happens more frequently. Positive reinforcement. We're going to positively reinforce that behavior. We want to increase the frequency of that behavior due to its positive outcome. It gets a reward. So that's what we want to do. We want to increase how often that behavior happens. We're positively reinforcing it so that it happens more often. And negative reinforcement, now just be careful, and you'll see this now, there's a difference between reinforcement and punishment. Do not get the two muddled up. There's a very big difference between them, and I will explain it. So positive reinforcement is about increasing the frequency of behavior due to its positive outcome. Okay, a reward that happens. Negative reinforcement is a response or behavior that's strengthened by stopping or removing a negative outcome. So if something happens and the outcome of that behavior is negative, the behavior would be strengthened. Okay, we're removing something negative from the environment. So in the little picture, that's as such, negative reinforcement is the idea that instead of adding an unfavorable outcome to deter bad behavior or a punishment, you're actually removing something unfavorable in order to encourage good behavior. In positive reinforcement, a response leads to the presentation of a rewarding stimulus. We know that. Do something positive, you get a rewarding stimulus. In negative reinforcement, a response leads to the removal of an aversive stimulus. Both types of reinforcement involve favorable consequences, and both have the same effect on behavior. The organism's tendency to emit the reinforced response is strengthened. Okay. So positive reinforcement, the rat, Skinner's rat. Okay, the behavior pushes the lever. Rewarding stimulus presented, the food is delivered. So therefore the tendency to press the lever is increased. It is being rewarded. Now think about the shock. We know the little rat's getting a shock, but every time it pushes the lever, it turns the shock off. It is removing a negative consequence from the environment. So in the first one, it's being rewarded positively, positive reinforcement. In the second one, it's having something negative being taken away. So the rat would carry on pushing that lever, because as often as it pushed the lever, that shock would not happen. So negative reinforcement is we are removing something negative from the environment. The behavior will continue to happen to ensure that that negative outcome does not take place. So positive reinforcement, there it is on the left, introduce a reinforcing stimulus following a good behavior or positive behavior. Negative reinforcement, strengthen a behavior that avoids or removes a negative outcome. I don't use sunblock, therefore I get sunburned. If we want to take the sunburn as a negative response out of the situation, apply the sun cream. That's operant learning. We're taking something negative away, getting sunburn, and we then would use sunblock more frequently. Our behavior of using sunblock increases. We use it more often. Everyone is very quiet. Maybe I need another spider on my screen very soon. So then we work out what is the difference now with punishment. So we have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Punishment, think about punishment. Punishment is any consequence that reduces the frequency of that behavior. So we punish somebody because we want the behavior to stop. Okay, positive reinforcement means we want the behavior to increase. Negative reinforcement, we're taking away something negative so the behavior will increase. Whereas punishment, okay, is about associating something negative with that behavior. We want to reduce the behavior. So if the rats got a shock when they touched the lever, they'd stop touching the lever. Okay, that's what punishment is. But again, just to confuse us even more, we have positive punishment and negative punishment, and just purely think in the context of punishment now. So punishment, positive punishment, it's not positive, okay, but we call it positive punishment because we're going to compare it to negative punishment. Positive punishment is a negative, applying something, an aversive consequence, a smack. Okay, a smack is something that reduces the frequency of the behavior. If a child is naughty and you smack the child, it's a negative, aversive consequence. Okay, and the behavior should reduce. It's a positive form of punishment compared to a negative, is the removal of something desirable. So if I punish you negatively, if you go out and stay out past curfew and you're a teenager or whatever, if I ground you, okay, it's a negative punishment. It's removing something desirable from your environment. You're being punished, but not in a way that is an aversive consequence that reduces the frequency. It's the removal of something desirable. That's what a negative punishment is. So as much as we have positive and negative conditioning, we have positive and negative punishment, and those are two different things. Okay, a little note at the bottom there. So often it's better to reinforce the desired behavior than using punishment to stop the behavior. So therefore we should positively reinforce good behavior rather than negative punishment will also reduce the frequency. You won't go out again. So your behavior is reduced. What we're trying to do in reinforcing is sort of reward good behavior. Punishment is reducing the frequency of a behavior, whether you do it through an aversive way of a positive punishment or taking something away that's positive, making it negative, taking it away. So research is clear. Spanking is both ineffective and ultimately harmful to children, and reinforcement beats punishment. Reinforcement for subsequent behavior is more appropriate. And that's a very big debate, is that we shouldn't spank children. You rather spend time reinforcing good behavior than punishing, either through a positive or a negative way, undesirable behavior. So that is the debate around punishment. So reinforcement, if I reinforce good behavior, I'm increasing the frequency of the behavior. Punishment decreases the frequency of the behavior. So the application of a positive stimulus brings about an increase in the frequency of behavior and is referred to as positive reinforcement. An application of a negative stimulus decreases or reduces the frequency of the behavior and is called punishment. The removal of a negative stimulus increases the frequency of behavior as negative reinforcement, and the removal of a positive stimulus that decreases the frequency of behavior is negative punishment. Okay, I think that makes sense. Think about it in examples like I've given you, and you will soon see the difference between reinforcement and punishment and how those differ. And it's important. Operant conditioning is a very important part of our lives. Now I've lost my mouse. Let me just move on to the next slide. I'm also just aware of time. So schedules of reinforcement. We can reinforce the behavior every time it happens. It's continuous. Every time we do it, we reinforce. So therefore, the behavior gets more and more frequent every single time. But we also know that that's not always going to happen. If a child is at home, you can't reinforce every time, but you can do it some of the time. So sometimes it's on a ratio schedule. So the number of times it occurs, there will be a reward. We don't have to reward something every single time. We shouldn't get to that point that we do it every single time. But it could be after a certain number of times you reward the behavior. So this is the example given as piecework. You say you're working in a factory and you have to make I don't know, 100 pairs of shorts, and you get paid after you've made every 100 pairs, and then next time is 200 pairs, 300 pairs. As we know, we're going to get rewarded after a certain number of pairs of shorts have been made in this factory. So we work as fast as possible. Money is the incentive, money is the reward in this case, to actually work as fast as possible, because we know every time we've completed our batch, we get paid and we move on to the next batch faster and faster and faster, but we know that that's there. A variable ratio schedule means that we're not too sure how often this is going to happen. We know it's going to happen after a certain number of times, but we're not too sure when. The picture there is, think about a slot machine. Think about that in a casino. When you start pulling the lever on that slot machine, you're going to know that at some point after a certain number of pulls, you're going to be rewarded. You're not exactly sure when. It's variable. And that's what the casinos depend upon. You can't predict when that reinforcement is going to happen. When is that slot machine going to go ding, 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 and throw out a whole lot of coins at you? So you just sit there and you pull it. You almost keep going with a steady rate of responding, because you know at some point in that interval schedule, ratio schedule, you would be rewarded. Okay, so that's about reinforcement in a ratio kind of way after a certain number of times or pulls or what you've made. Then there's an interval schedule. So that's about time. So it's a fixed amount of time before the reinforcement becomes available. So overall, your response rates are a lot lower than if you're working at an interval schedule, a ratio schedule. And as soon as you've been reinforced, you slow down again, because you know that I'm only going to be this, whatever I'm doing is only going to be reinforced at the next 12-hour mark or whatever. And if, again, you can have that variable. You know that it's going to happen after a certain period of time, but you're not quite sure when. So you carry on with a high, steady rate of what you're doing, knowing that at some point in the very near future, the time will elapse and you will be rewarded. So that's the difference in reinforcement ratio and interval schedules, is that it's impossible to continuously reinforce behaviors. So your best way of reinforcing a behavior is really like a variable ratio schedule. With a negative picture there of someone who's got a bit of a gambling addiction and why they sit in a casino all the time. Okay, one moment. So just again, I mean, this is just, it's in your book, and I won't touch on it because I am aware of time. It just talks about, you know, now in terms of conditioning, both classical and operant conditioning is, different species are different to be conditioned in different ways. Okay, we're not all conditioned to do the same thing. Animals and humans, learning learning happens in animals and humans, but we don't all learn in the same way. We're not all conditioned to respond in the same way. Species specific, very much. So we think about the phobia, we think about what I said about how you could be fearful of spiders but not know why. There could be an evolutionary component to that, where there's a genetic memory that can also sort of almost be passed down based upon survival from our ancestors. One of the things you see as an African culture, the fear of snakes. It might not be that you yourself have been conditioned to fear snakes, but also when we look at cultural history, there's almost like a conditioning that's passed down through our generations as a part of a collective consciousness, a genetic memory. Which can lead to a phobia of snakes. So there's evolutionary components. And also sometimes learning can take place in the absence of reinforcement as well. Sometimes we do something and we're not exactly sure how we learned to do it. It's called latent learning. It almost seems like an inbuilt learning in us. There's not necessarily a reinforcement that we're aware of, but we know how to do something. And again, with cognitive development, our mind makes cognitive maps. We can see how a behavior will map out. We've got a cognitive map in our mind as to what the outcome will be. It's part of also we've evolved to think in a more cognitively complex way, that we're not taught everything in our lives. Some of those things that we do are almost we've learned them and we're not sure how we've learned them. And again, our instincts can take over. So instinctive drift. An animal, you teach a pig to, example, pig drops money into a money box, but it's almost like eventually that learned behavior it becomes overcome with the pig's natural instinct to root around in the dirt. It is an instinctive drift. And obviously the presence of others in our lives, social influence, very big issue in operant conditioning, especially, is the presence of others might be necessary for learning. That whole social interaction about motivation and focus on things that contribute to effective learning. And the presence of others when we're doing a task around us that sometimes having people around we might be shy and inhibited might make our performance slower. Otherwise, we might be inspired to perform better if other people are around us. So there's a lot of things within the learning process that we draw from our environment. And we're nearly done. 5 minutes, quick. Observational learning. That's the final piece of learning. And that's learning through watching others. We watch people, models in our lives. It's a very big part of learning, is learning by watching others. So basically what it does is it's the ability to learn by watching people or models, which ultimately does extend what classical and operant conditioning are able to do. If you watch someone else being rewarded, if someone else in your class gets a higher mark and you know that they've learned really hard for a test, you have observed them. You're going to model their behavior because you've watched them being rewarded. So it almost expands the reach of classical and operant conditioning into the process of observational learning. And remember, with observational learning, if we're learning through watching someone, those negative consequences of learning don't happen to us directly. They happen to the models that we're watching. So if you watch somebody being punished for a bad behavior, you're going to learn from that. We don't experience the negative consequences ourselves, but you have learned through observing that child or that peer be punished, whatever it might be. And again, because we're very social beings, observational learning is very powerful, and it can override many other influences on our behavior because we're social people. And again, it can influence positive and negative experiences. And the key part of observational learning boils down to Albert Bandura's experiment with a Bobo doll. The Bobo doll is a big inflatable clown-shaped balloon, and it linked to imitation. And remember, imitation is part of learning. Our kids model us. If we are in a position of leadership or authority, we're a model to people who work around us. It's so important to be aware that we're modeling behavior too. We're not just observing it, we actually are models for other people. So imitation is a behavior that's unlikely to occur naturally and spontaneously. That's what imitation is. You don't just imitate someone unless you've seen them act out that behavior. So what they did was they put adults in a room and they got adults to verbally, physically assault this blow-up Bobo doll. They kick it and punch it and hit it and everything else. And so after the adults had done that, the kids were watching this. They were either, there was an example they watched through a window, or also it was as a pre-recorded thing. But what we want to see is, do children imitate adults' behavior, especially when it's linked to aggression? So you can see this has a very real impact on our society. I mean, that's still, it's a very big issue that we contend with as a society, is people imitating aggression and violence. So in some cases, the adults were rewarded once they beat and hit and kicked the Bobo doll, or sometimes they weren't. They were punished. But regardless of that, the fact that still the children saw that, they still displayed aggression. Whether the adult was rewarded or punished, the behavior was imitated by the child, although it was imitated more often when the adult had been rewarded. But regardless of that, the actual behavior of aggression was imitated. And in order to be imitated, there are 4 processes that need to happen. Okay, obviously, it's a behavior that's got to grab our attention. So, I mean, again, if someone's on the rugby field and there's a fight between 2 of the rugby players, and it's sort of it grows into a bit of a brawl and everyone's fighting each other, you pay attention to that behavior. Behaviors that elicit attention are more likely to be repeated. We're all sitting there, we're all watching it on TV, we see it, we've paid attention to it. The chance it's going to be modeled by our kids when they go onto a rugby field, because they saw those guys on the TV behaving like that. it's more likely to be repeated. They've paid attention to it. You've got to retain the memory of what the model did. It can't be something that you've forgotten about. You've got to remember that. You've got to be able to reproduce it. So if our kids see fighting on the television on a rugby field, and they are little rugby players at preschool or primary school, and they play rugby, yeah, they're very likely able to reproduce that behavior. Okay, so it's got to be something that can be reproduced, and they've got to be motivated to perform the behavior. So maybe those guys were treated like heroes. It would motivate the child to act in a similar way on their own rugby field. So you can see how imitation is very important in observational learning when we look at behavior. And the final slide, and we're spot on 7 o'clock, and it's still all very quiet. It's the final part of it. It's around observational learning and violence and the media. I mean, it's been very in our consciousness at the moment with that school shooting in the States, and how often you see that it's children who take guns to school, and the gun lobby, anti-guns. So the parents watch on TV and they see it, and the child sees it. So it's the power of modeling. What they see is what you get. So remember that when what children see or what adults see is you see the outcome of that, the power of modeling. Acts of imitative aggression were most frequent among children exposed to aggressive role models on TV whose aggression was rewarded. Okay, really important to see, and it's becoming more and more prevalent on television. And you can see on the left there, the internet, access to uncensored media, newspapers, magazines, radios in our societies around us. Those places to imitate aggressive behavior are happening more and more frequently. So in children, but again, in youth, does it increase the level of aggression? It does, but also the thing is we become desensitized to it. People show muted reactions to violence. There's that desensitization to stimuli. Through what we see, we become desensitized. The numbing effect of the media, violence in the media, makes us less sensitive to the suffering of others. How true is that? That often what we see actually makes us less sensitive. We become hardcore, if we can put it in inverted commas. We become less sensitive because what's happening around us. High exposure to media violence causes high aggressiveness. And aggression can be also influenced by genetics, as we've seen, parental modeling, a predisposition. Some people are predispositioned to become aggressive, as well as by our peers. So observational learning and violence is a very big issue, and it is one of our learning outcomes. So that's it, guys. That was very quiet. I feel like I've talked to myself. There's not many of you. I'm going to end the recording now, but if anyone's got any questions, please ask them. It's all very silent, so I would assume there's not really any questions. If you're all still with me, otherwise I will just say good evening. I hope that made sense. Thanks, guys. Thanks for still being here. Thanks for listening. I will put up the recording. I hope to see you all at the national support session tomorrow. It's a very straightforward paper, so we'll just pop through it quickly tomorrow so we can just check the boxes so you understand. But hopefully you'll work hard at this assignment. Hopefully the behavior from the last assignment, if you did do your referencing, you're now actually going to go and check up on your referencing, work harder, etc., etc. So that's learning, and it's there. So yeah, this is our last learning unit, but we'll do the national support session tomorrow, and then we'll do maybe a revision learning unit before the exam. So yeah, guys, keep up the hard work. Aiming for the stars, always, always. Positive rewards. Yeah, positive reinforcement. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to give you the positive reinforcement in your marks at the end of your assignment. So yeah. Awesome, guys. Have a good evening. Hopefully load shedding doesn't get you down, but stick with it. Work hard.